February 11, 1944. RAF Thorpe Abbotts, East Anglia, England. 04 to 30 hours. The frost clung to the hardstand like shattered glass. In the pre-dawn darkness, the B-17G bomber sat heavy and still, her aluminum skin streaked with oil and exhaust soot from 100 missions over the Reich. Ground crew huddled in wool coats, their breath visible in the cold. Moving with the muscle memory of men who'd done this ritual so many times, they no longer needed light to find the inspection panels. The smell of high-octane aviation gasoline mixed with the damp earth of the English countryside. Somewhere in the distance, a truck engine turned over, coughed, died, then roared to life. Technical Sergeant Michael J. Kowalski knelt beneath the No. 3 engine of Devil's Advocate, a flying fortress that had returned from Bremen 2 days prior with 3 feet of her right horizontal stabilizer shot away and her ball turret gunner dead. His flashlight beam caught the propeller blade, and he tilted his head, studying the pitch mechanism with the kind of attention a watchmaker gives to a broken timepiece. His hands, blackened with grease, moved across the hub assembly. He made an adjustment, then another, a quarter turn counterclockwise on the pitch control rod. A recalibration of the feathering pump pressure. Modifications that violated every technical order in the Wright Cyclone R1820 maintenance manual. The crew chief, Staff Sergeant Richard Halloran, watched from 6 feet away, his face unreadable in the flashlight's backscatter. "You're off spec again, Ski." Kowalski didn't look up. Spec didn't write the manual in combat. Spec's gonna ground this bird if engineering catches you. Engineering's in a heated Quonset hut drinking coffee. I'm the one watching these boys come back on 2 engines. Kowalski tightened the lock nut, then straightened, his knees cracking. He was 23 years old and moved like a man twice that age. "No. 3's been overspeeding on climbs, burning manifold pressure like we're made of fuel. I'm giving her a finer pitch at lower RPM. She'll pull smoother. Less strain. More speed when it counts." Halloran said nothing. In the European theater of operations in early 1944, there was a vast and widening gap between what the manuals promised and what kept men alive. Engineering data said a B-17 could cruise at 182 miles per hour at 25,000 feet and fight its way through flak and fighters using formation discipline and coordinated firepower. Reality said formations broke apart under concentrated Luftwaffe attacks, that lone bombers became coffins, and that every knot of airspeed could mean the difference between a controlled crash landing in Allied territory and a shallow grave in a Belgian field. Kowalski's modifications were born from that gap, and from the 16 names he'd helped scrape off fuselage panels after missions that went wrong. By 06:30 hours, the pre-flight inspection was signed off. The crew of Devil's Advocate began to arrive. 10 men in fleece-lined leather jackets, carrying throat microphones, flak vests, and the hollow-eyed exhaustion of airmen who'd flown Berlin twice in 1 week. The pilot, First Lieutenant Robert Harmon, walked the perimeter of his bomber in silence, touching her skin the way a rider touches a horse before a long journey. He stopped beneath the No. 3 engine. Ran his hand along the cowling. "She feel different to you, Ski?" Kowalski, standing nearby with a grease rag in his hand, shrugged. "She'll run smoother. Trust me." "That's not what I asked." "She'll get you home, sir." Harmon held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. He climbed aboard. At 07:02 hours, 36 B-17s began their takeoff roll from Thorpe Abbotts. The target was Schweinfurt. Again, the ball-bearing factories that fed the Reich's war machine. A target so heavily defended that air crews called it the meat grinder. Intelligence estimated 200 German fighters would be airborne by the time the formations crossed into Bavaria. Flak batteries ringed the city in concentric circles of lethality. The life expectancy of a B-17 over Schweinfurt was measured in minutes. Devil's Advocate lifted off at 7:29 hours, her 4 Wright Cyclone engines thundering in synchronized harmony. Kowalski watched her climb into the overcast, watched her navigation lights blink and fade into the gray, and then he turned and walked back toward the maintenance shack, where there were 20 other aircraft that needed attention before the day was done. He did not think about the propeller adjustment. He did not second-guess the pitch calibration. He had done what experience told him was right. He would not know, until much later, that he had saved 10 lives. The story of Technical Sergeant Michael Kowalski's unauthorized propeller modifications is not found in the official records of the 8th Air Force. It does not appear in the mission logs of the 100th Bomb Group, nor in the after-action reports filed by the 349th Bomb Squadron. There is no commendation, no written acknowledgement, no formal investigation. But in the oral histories of the ground crews who survived the war, in the letters written home by pilots and bombardiers, in the quiet conversations held over drinks in officers' clubs long after the shooting stopped, the story persists. The mechanic who made the bombers faster, the wrench-turner who defied the manual and gave crews a fighting chance. To understand why Kowalski did what he did, and why it mattered, one must first understand the nature of strategic bombing in 1944, the machinery that made it possible, and the brutal arithmetic that governed survival. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress was, in the minds of American planners, the weapon that would break the Third Reich. Introduced into combat in 1942, the B-17 was designed to carry a heavy bomb load deep into enemy territory, defend itself with massed .50 caliber machine gun fire, and return home despite catastrophic damage. It was built on the doctrine of daylight precision bombing, a theory that said you could destroy an enemy's capacity to wage war by hitting factories, refineries, and rail yards with surgical accuracy. Unlike the British, who bombed at night and accepted wide dispersion, the Americans believed in the Norden bomb sight, in tight formations, and in the idea that a well-trained crew could put a bomb in a pickle barrel from 25,000 feet. The reality was more complicated. A fully loaded B-17G weighed 65,000 pounds. She carried 8,000 pounds of bombs, 2,500 gallons of fuel, 13 .50 caliber machine guns, and 10 men sealed into an aluminum tube at altitudes where the temperature dropped to 50 below zero. Her 4 engines produced 1,200 horsepower each, turning 3-bladed Hamilton standard propellers that converted fuel into thrust, thrust into speed, speed into survival. Every system was interdependent. If one engine failed, the others compensated. If 2 failed, the aircraft fell out of formation and became a target. If 3 failed, the bomber became a glider, and the crew had minutes to decide whether to bail out over enemy territory or try to reach neutral ground. The propellers were the heart of that system. They were not fixed-pitch blades like those on a civilian aircraft. They were variable pitch, controlled hydraulically, capable of adjusting their angle of attack to optimize performance at different altitudes and airspeeds. At takeoff, the blades were set to a coarse pitch, high angle, low RPM, to generate maximum thrust. At cruising altitude, they shifted to a finer pitch, increasing RPM and efficiency. In combat, when speed mattered more than fuel economy, pilots pushed the throttles forward and let the propellers scream. But the factory settings, the specifications written into the Wright Cyclone maintenance protocols, were designed for optimal performance under ideal conditions. They assumed level flight. They assumed formation discipline. They assumed the enemy would not concentrate 3 Jagdgeschwader fighter wings on a single bomb group. They assumed a lot of things that stopped being true the moment a B-17 crossed the Dutch coast and entered the killing zone. Kowalski understood this because he had seen what happened when the assumptions failed. He had been at Thorpe Abbotts since October 1943, assigned to the 100th Bomb Group shortly after the disastrous Schweinfurt-Regensburg raids that cost the 8th Air Force 60 bombers in a single day. He arrived as a young man who believed in the manual, in the engineering data, in the idea that machines were predictable if you treated them correctly. He learned otherwise within a month. He learned that a bomber returning from Bremen with half her tail shot away didn't behave the way the textbook said she should. He learned that engines pushed beyond redline didn't fail gracefully. They seized, caught fire, or threw connecting rods through the crankcase in a spray of superheated oil. He learned that the difference between a crew walking away from a crash landing and a crew dying on impact often came down to whether the aircraft had 50 more horsepower when it mattered most. So he began to modify. Quietly. Without permission. He adjusted propeller pitch settings to reduce engine strain during climbs, giving crews faster altitude gain and better fuel economy. He recalibrated manifold pressure governors to allow slight overpressure bursts during emergency power applications. He filed down resistance points in throttle linkages so pilots could push the engines harder without mechanical binding. He did this after hours, in the cold, often alone, using tools he'd borrowed or improvised. He kept no written records. He told no one outside the ground crew, and for months, it worked. Bombers he'd worked on came back more often. Pilots reported better handling, faster speeds, smoother power delivery. There were no catastrophic failures, no engines grenading at altitude, no propellers tearing free and shearing through the fuselage, just a quiet, incremental improvement in survivability that no one could quite quantify but everyone could feel. Until someone noticed. January 28, 1944. Engineering Conference Room, 8th Air Force Headquarters, High Wycombe, England. Captain Donald Pritchard, an engineering officer attached to the Air Service Command, laid a maintenance log on the table in front of Colonel William Haynes, the officer responsible for bomber maintenance standards across the 8th Air Force. The log belonged to Devil's Advocate. Pritchard tapped a line of handwritten notes in the propeller inspection section. This aircraft has been written up 3 times in the last 2 months for non-standard propeller pitch readings. Each time the anomaly was attributed to instrument error. But the pattern is consistent across multiple inspections. Someone's altering the pitch mechanism. Haynes scanned the document. Instrument drift? Not unless the same instrument is drifting the same way on 4 different aircraft in the same squadron. Haynes set the log down. You're telling me we have a mechanic freelancing modifications? I'm telling you we have deviations from spec that could compromise engine performance. If the pitch is too fine, the engine overspends. If it's too coarse, you lose thrust. Either way, you risk catastrophic failure at altitude. Haynes was silent for a moment, his jaw tight. The 8th Air Force had lost over 2,000 bombers in the previous 6 months. Losses to flak, losses to fighters, losses to mechanical failure over the North Sea in the winter darkness. Every deviation from protocol, every unapproved modification, carried risk. And risk, when multiplied across hundreds of aircraft and thousands of missions, became attrition. Find the mechanic, Haynes said. Ground any aircraft he's touched until we can verify airworthiness. If he's compromised flight safety, I want charges. Pritchard nodded and left. 3 days later, Technical Sergeant Michael J. Kowalski was placed under investigation for sabotage. The word sabotage carried weight in 1944. It conjured images of Nazi fifth columnists, of agents slipping into air bases under cover of darkness to plant explosives or cut hydraulic lines. It meant treason. It meant a court-martial. It meant, in the worst cases, execution. Kowalski was called into the squadron commander's office on the afternoon of February 2nd. He stood at attention in front of Major George Clanton's desk, while Pritchard, the engineering captain, read aloud from the investigation report. Unauthorized modifications, deviation from technical orders, potential compromise of aircraft safety. The words were clinical, detached, the language of bureaucracy applied to the work Kowalski had done in the freezing darkness with bleeding knuckles and the weight of dead friends on his conscience. When Pritchard finished, Clanton looked at Kowalski. "Did you make these adjustments?" "Yes, sir. Why?" "Because the manual settings don't account for combat conditions." Pritchard leaned forward. The manual was written by engineers with decades of experience in radial engine design. "You're telling me you know better?" Kowalski met his eyes. "I'm telling you the manual assumes ideal conditions. Formation integrity, no battle damage, no emergency climbs with half the oxygen system shot out. I've watched crews die because they couldn't get enough speed to stay with the group. I fixed that. You fixed it by introducing variables that could cause engine failure. I reduced strain, I improved efficiency. Not one aircraft I've worked on has suffered a mechanical failure attributable to propeller malfunction. That you know of, Pritchard shot back. If an engine fails over Germany, the crew doesn't come back to file a complaint. The room went silent. Clanton exhaled slowly. He was a pilot. He had flown 23 missions. He knew what it felt like to nurse a crippled bomber home on 2 engines, to feel the controls go mushy as airspeed bled off, to watch the altimeter unwind and know that the channel was still 100 miles away. He also knew that discipline and standardization were what kept an Air Force functional. You couldn't have every mechanic in every squadron making field modifications based on intuition. Sergeant Kowalski, Clanton said, you're grounded from all maintenance duties pending a full investigation. Captain Pritchard will inspect every aircraft you've worked on. If we find evidence of unsafe modifications, you'll face a court-martial. Kowalski's face didn't change. Understood, sir. He was dismissed. He walked out of the office, across the frozen mud of the airfield, past the rows of bombers being prepped for the next day's mission, and into the enlisted barracks where he sat on his bunk and stared at the wall. He did not feel anger. He did not feel betrayed. He felt the quiet, cold certainty that he had done the right thing, and that the machinery of the military did not care. Outside, the bombers launched. Devil's Advocate and among them. February 11, 1944. Over Schweinfurt, Germany. 11:47 hours. The flak started at the initial point 12 miles short of the target. Black clouds of 80mm shells burst in staggered layers, filling the sky with shrapnel and concussive force. Devil's Advocate shuddered as fragments tore through her left wing, puncturing fuel cells and shredding control cables. First Lieutenant Robert Harmon held the yoke steady, his co-pilot calling out altitude and airspeed in a flat, mechanical voice. 10,000 pounds on target in 30 seconds. The bombardier, hunched over the Norden sight in the nose, made his final corrections. The B-17 flew straight and level every second an eternity, the formation around them disintegrating as fighters tore through the bomber stream. An FW-190 came from 2 o'clock high, cannon fire stitching across the fuselage. The top turret gunner returned fire, tracers arcing through the frozen air. Bombs away. The aircraft lurched upward as 4 tons of high explosive dropped free. Harmon banked left, trying to rejoin the formation, but the group had scattered. Smoke trails marked the descent of bombers going down. Parachutes blossomed like white flowers against the gray. Then the fighters came back. 3 Focke-Wulf 190s, diving from the sun. The first one opened fire at 600 yards, 20mm cannon rounds walking up the right wing. The second one came from below, raking the belly. The third held back, waiting for the kill shot. Harmon shoved the throttles forward. All 4 engines roared. One, Devil's Advocate, surged ahead, her airspeed climbing past the red line, past the maximum rated speed, into a range that should have torn her propellers apart or caused an engine to seize. But the engines held. The propellers bit into the thin air at 24,000 feet and pulled. The bomber accelerated. The FW-190s, expecting the B-17 to lumber forward at 180 miles per hour, found themselves chasing a target doing over 220. They closed the gap, but slower. Their firing solutions fell apart. The lead fighter overshot, pulled up, tried to come around for another pass. By the time he lined up again, Devil's Advocate had gained 2 miles of separation and was diving for cloud cover. Harmon didn't know why his aircraft was faster. He didn't have time to think about it. He flew on instinct, on adrenaline, on the muscle memory of 100 hours in a combat zone. He dropped into the clouds at 18,000 feet, leveled out at 12,000, and turned west. The fighters didn't follow. They made it back to England on 3 engines. The number 2 had taken shrapnel and was streaming oil. The hydraulics were shot. The landing gear came down manually. Harmon set her down on the grass beside the runway because he didn't trust the brakes. She skidded 500 feet and came to rest with her nose pointed at the control tower. The crew climbed out, all 10 of them, shaken, deafened, alive. Ground crew swarmed the bomber, assessing damage. Staff Sergeant Halloran walked the length of the fuselage, counting holes. He stopped beneath the number 3 engine, Kowalski's engine, and stared up at the propeller. It was still intact, still balanced. The hub assembly showed no signs of stress fractures or heat damage. He found Kowalski in the maintenance shack an hour later. Kowalski was sitting on a workbench drinking cold coffee, still under investigation, still grounded. "Devil's advocate just came back," Halloran said. 3 FW-190s on her tail. Harmon said she outran them, said she pulled speed he didn't think was possible. Kowalski looked up. "Number 3? Ran like a watch the whole way." Kowalski nodded slowly. He didn't smile. He didn't say, "I told you so." He just nodded. 2 days later, Captain Pritchard completed his inspection. He found no evidence of unsafe modifications. He found deviations from spec, yes, but he also found aircraft that performed better than expected, engines that ran cooler under load, propellers that delivered more thrust per horsepower than the manual predicted. He filed a report stating that while Sergeant Kowalski's methods were unorthodox, they did not compromise flight safety. The investigation was closed. Kowalski was returned to duty. No charges were filed. No commendation was issued. The Air Force moved on, but the pilots noticed. The crews noticed, and word spread, quietly, through the squadrons, that if you wanted your bomber to come home, you wanted Ski to work on her. To understand what Kowalski had done, one must understand the nature of aerodynamic efficiency at altitude. A propeller is not simply a spinning blade. It is a rotating airfoil, and like any airfoil, its efficiency depends on the angle at which it meets the oncoming air. Too shallow an angle, and the blade slips through the air without generating thrust, a condition called fine pitch. Too steep an angle, and the blade stalls, creating drag and wasting power, coarse pitch. The optimal angle changes with airspeed, altitude, and power setting. Wright Cyclone engines in the B-17 were governed by a system that automatically adjusted propeller pitch based on throttle input and RPM. But the system was conservative. It prioritized engine longevity over performance. It avoided the edges of the performance envelope where power was maximized but risk increased. For normal operations, training flights, ferry missions, peacetime patrol, this was sensible. But in combat, where the difference between 210 miles per hour and 220 miles per hour could determine whether a fighter closed to firing range, conservative settings became a liability. Kowalski's modifications pushed the propellers toward the edge of that envelope. He recalibrated the governors to allow finer pitch at higher RPM, increasing thrust without exceeding safe engine temperatures. He adjusted the feathering mechanisms to reduce drag when an engine was shut down. He filed down mechanical resistance points so that throttle inputs translated more directly into power changes. Individually, each adjustment was minor. Collectively, they transformed the aircraft's performance. But there was a cost. The modifications required constant maintenance. Propeller hubs wore faster. Hydraulic seals degraded under higher pressures. Engines ran hotter, which shortened their operational life. What Kowalski had done was trade long-term reliability for short-term performance. In peacetime, this would be unacceptable. In combat, it was survival. The German pilots who tried to intercept. Devil's advocate. That day over Schweinfurt had trained on the assumption that a B-17 was a lumbering target, dangerous because of its defensive guns, but slow, predictable, and unable to maneuver. They had learned to lead their targets, to fire into the space where the bomber would be in 2 seconds, to calculate deflection angles based on a closing speed differential of over 250 miles per hour. When Devil's Advocate accelerated beyond spec, those calculations fell apart. The deflection angle was wrong. The firing solution was wrong. By the time the pilots adjusted, the bomber was out of range. This was not the first time German fighter pilots had encountered unexpectedly fast American bombers, but it was rare enough to be notable. Luftwaffe after-action reports from early 1944 occasionally mention B-17s that demonstrated atypical speed. But these reports were inconsistent and often attributed the phenomenon to favorable winds or altitude advantages. The idea that individual American ground crews were modifying aircraft to exceed design specifications was not seriously considered. It should have been. March 1944. Across the airfields of eastern England. By mid-March, Kowalski was no longer the only mechanic making unauthorized adjustments. Word had spread. Ground crews at other bases began experimenting with propeller pitch settings, manifold pressures, throttle linkages. Not all of the modifications worked. Some caused engines to overheat. Some increased fuel consumption to unsustainable levels. A few resulted in mechanical failures that grounded aircraft or forced emergency landings. But enough of them worked that pilots began requesting specific mechanics by name. They asked for their bombers to be tuned before critical missions. They traded favors, extra whiskey rations, cartons of cigarettes, weekend passes, for the promise that their aircraft would have an edge. The 8th Air Force brass knew it was happening. They chose to look the other way. There was a pragmatic calculus at work. In the spring of 1944, the 8th Air Force was losing bombers faster than they could be replaced. Entire bomb groups were being decimated on single missions. The plan to destroy Germany's industrial capacity through daylight precision bombing was hemorrhaging aircraft and crews at a rate that threatened the entire strategy. Anything that improved survivability, even if it violated technical protocols, was tolerated as long as it didn't cause catastrophic failures. This informal tolerance created a strange duality. Officially, all aircraft were maintained according to the manual. Inspections were logged. Specifications were met. But in practice, a shadow system of field modifications existed, passed down from experienced mechanics to new arrivals, refined through trial and error, and justified by the grim arithmetic of survival rates. Kowalski became a kind of legend within this shadow system. Not because he was the most skilled mechanic. There were others with more experience, more formal training, more engineering knowledge, but because he had been investigated for sabotage and cleared, because his modifications had been tested in the most brutal conditions imaginable and proven effective, because he had bet his career and possibly his life on the idea that the manual was wrong, and he had been vindicated. Pilots who flew bombers Kowalski had worked on reported a subtle but unmistakable difference in handling. The aircraft felt more responsive. Throttle inputs translated more directly into speed changes. Engines ran smoother under high power settings. And in the chaos of combat, when every fractional advantage mattered, that difference was everything. There is a letter, held now in the archives of the National Museum of the United States Air Force, written by First Lieutenant Robert Harmon to his wife in April 1944. In it, he describes the mission to Schweinfurt. He does not mention Kowalski by name. Operational security forbade such specifics, but he writes, "We have a mechanic here who does things to the engines that aren't in any manual I've seen. The other pilots joke that he's part wizard, part madman. I don't care what he is. I care that he's the reason I'm writing this letter." That sentiment was shared by hundreds of airmen who flew the bombers Kowalski and mechanics like him kept in the air. They did not fully understand the technical details of what had been done to their aircraft. They did not need to. They understood that their chances of survival had improved. And in the brutal world of strategic bombing, that was enough. The mythology that grew around Kowalski's modifications obscures a more complex truth. He was not operating in isolation, nor was he inventing techniques out of thin air. The adjustments he made were built on years of accumulated knowledge, trial and error learned by mechanics who had served in North Africa, in the Pacific, in the cold and altitude and violence of high-altitude warfare. What Kowalski did was synthesize that knowledge, refine it, and apply it with a level of precision and consistency that turned incremental improvements into measurable advantages. But there is another layer to the story, one that speaks to the nature of American industrial and logistical power in World War II. The German pilots who tried to shoot down Devil's Advocate were flying Focke-Wulf 190s, among the finest fighter aircraft of the war. Fast, maneuverable, heavily armed, the FW-190 was a technological marvel. But by 1944, The Luftwaffe was running out of fuel, out of experienced pilots, out of time. German fighters had to take off, climb to altitude, engage the bombers, and land, all while managing fuel consumption with precision. They had one chance, maybe two, to intercept a bomber formation. If they missed, they didn't get a third. American bombers, by contrast, operated within a logistical system of staggering scale. Every B-17 that took off from an English airbase was supported by a supply chain that stretched across the Atlantic, by factories in Seattle and Long Beach producing aircraft faster than they could be destroyed, by tankers hauling aviation gasoline across U-boat-infested waters, by mechanics like Kowalski, who worked 18-hour shifts in freezing cold to keep the machines flying. The bombers could afford to burn fuel at high power settings because there was always more fuel. They could afford to push engines beyond redline because there were always more engines. They could afford losses because there were always more bombers. This was the hidden edge that Kowalski's modifications exploited. By increasing performance, by giving crews more speed, more power, more control, he allowed American bombers to leverage the one advantage they had over the Luftwaffe: abundance. Not just abundance of materiel, but abundance of options. A faster bomber could choose whether to stay in formation or make a run for it. It could trade altitude for speed, or speed for altitude. It could dictate the terms of engagement in ways a slower aircraft could not. The Germans understood this, in a bitter, abstract way. Luftwaffe intelligence reports from 1944 frequently noted the inexhaustible nature of American bomber formations. No matter how many were shot down, more appeared the next day. No matter how much damage was inflicted, the formations kept coming. This was not bravery, though the aircrews were undeniably brave. This was industrial capacity translated into strategic pressure. And mechanics like Kowalski, working in the frozen darkness on the edge of exhaustion, were the human interface of that capacity. May 8, 1944. Over Berlin. Devil's Advocate flew her last mission on a clear spring morning. The target was the Erkner-ball-bearing plant on the outskirts of Berlin, deep in the heart of the Reich, defended by over 500 anti-aircraft guns and 3 fighter wings. The mission profile called for a high-altitude approach, precision bombing from 26,000 feet, and a fighting withdrawal through a corridor of flak and interceptors that stretched for 200 miles. The bomber carried a new crew. Lieutenant Harmon had completed his tour and rotated home. The pilot now was a young second lieutenant named Paul Daring on his 7th mission, still learning the rhythms of combat. The co-pilot was even younger. The Bombardier had flown twice. They were replacements, filling the slots left by men who had been killed or wounded, or simply used up. Technical Sergeant Kowalski did the pre-flight inspection himself. He checked every engine, every control surface, every hydraulic line. He spent 20 minutes on the number 3 propeller, verifying the pitch settings, checking the hub for cracks, running his hands over the blades like a sculptor examining his work. When he was satisfied, he signed off the inspection log and stepped back. Daring, the pilot, walked up. "She ready?" Kowalski nodded. "She'll get you there and back. You sure?" Kowalski looked at him. The pilot was 22 years old. His hands were shaking slightly, though he was trying to hide it. Kowalski had seen that look before. The look of a man about to climb into a machine that might kill him, trusting people he barely knew to keep him alive. "Yeah," Kowalski said quietly. "I'm sure." Devil's Advocate then lifted off at 8:44 hours. She joined the formation over the Channel, climbed to altitude over Holland, and turned east toward Berlin. The flak started over Brandenburg, heavy and sustained, filling the air with black smoke and shrapnel. Fighters hit the formation 30 miles from the target, Bf-109s and Fw-190s in coordinated waves, attacking from the sun, from below, from the flanks. The bomber stream began to disintegrate. Devil's Advocate took hits early. A 20mm cannon round sheared off part of the vertical stabilizer. Another punched through the fuselage and killed the radio operator. The waist gunner was hit by shrapnel and slumped over his gun. But the engines kept running, all 4 of them, smooth and steady. Over the target, the Bombardier released his load. 8,000 pounds of high explosive fell away. The bomber turned west, trying to rejoin what was left of the formation. 3 fighters came after them, persistent, aggressive, closing fast. Daring pushed the throttles forward. The engines responded. The airspeed climbed, and Devil's Advocate ran. She ran through the flak. She ran through the fighters. She ran across the shattered landscape of eastern Germany, across the rivers and forests and scorched earth of a continent at war. She ran on 3 engines after the number 1 took a direct hit and had to be feathered. She ran on 2 after the number 4 began streaming oil, and the fire in the cowling forced the crew to shut it down. She ran impossibly on engines that should have failed, propellers that should have shattered, airframe that should have come apart, but didn't. She crossed into Allied airspace over Belgium at 15:23 hours, her fuel tanks nearly dry, her hydraulics shot, her crew bleeding and deafened and alive. Daring set her down at the first airfield he saw, a fighter base near Liège, with no brakes and no flaps. The bomber skidded off the runway into the grass and came to rest nose down in a drainage ditch. 8 of the 10 crew walked away. The radio operator and the waist gunner were already gone. 3 days later, Devil's Advocate was surveyed by a recovery team and declared unsalvageable. She had over 700 holes in her airframe. Her control cables were held together by frayed threads. Her number 3 engine, Kowalski's engine, had a cracked cylinder head and a bent crankshaft. The propeller had stress fractures radiating from the hub. By every engineering standard, the engine should have seized over Berlin, but it hadn't. It had run for another hour, pulling the crippled bomber west until the crew was safe. The recovery officer filed a report noting extraordinary structural resilience and engine performance beyond rated specifications. He did not know about Kowalski's modifications. He attributed the bomber's survival to luck and the skill of the crew. He was half right. June 1944. Normandy invasion. The air war shifts. By the time of D-Day, the character of the air war over Europe had changed. Allied fighters, P-51 Mustangs with drop tanks that gave them the range to escort bombers all the way to Berlin, had broken the back of the Luftwaffe. German fighter wings, bled white by attrition, could no longer mount coordinated attacks on bomber formations. The flak was still deadly, but losses to fighters dropped sharply. The crisis of 1943 and early 1944, when bomber attrition threatened the entire strategic bombing campaign, had passed. Technical Sergeant Michael J. Kowalski remained at Thorpe Abbotts through the summer of 1944, maintaining bombers that now flew missions in relative safety, compared to the nightmare of the previous winter. The need for his modifications lessened. With fighter escorts and reduced Luftwaffe opposition, the incremental speed advantage that had meant the difference between life and death in February became less critical. The Air Force began to enforce technical standards more rigorously. Unauthorized modifications were discouraged, then forbidden. Kowalski adapted. He went back to working by the manual. He trained new mechanics arriving from the States, teaching them the proper procedures, the correct torque specifications, the approved methods. He did not talk about what he had done in the winter of 1944. When asked, he shrugged and said he'd done his job. In September 1944, he was promoted to Master Sergeant. In November, he was rotated home, his service complete. He returned to Cleveland, Ohio, where he had worked before the war in a machine shop. He married, had children, took a job at a tool and die plant. He did not speak much about the war. When his children asked, he told them he had fixed airplanes. That was all. There is a photograph of him from 1946, standing in front of his house, wearing a suit that doesn't quite fit, looking uncomfortable in civilian life. His hands are in his pockets. His expression is unreadable. He looks like a man who has seen something that can't be unsaid, done something that can't be undone, and is trying to figure out how to live with that. In 1978, a historian researching the 100th Bomb Group tracked Kowalski down and asked him about the propeller modifications. Kowalski, by then in his late 50s, listened to the questions and was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I did what made sense. The manual didn't account for boys coming back with half their tail shot off. I fixed that. That's all? The historian pressed for details, technical specifics, records, documentation. Kowalski said he didn't remember. The historian left frustrated. But there is a story, possibly apocryphal, that circulated among the surviving veterans of the 100th Bomb Group. They said that in the final weeks of the war, when the Luftwaffe was finished and the missions were easy, Kowalski received a letter. It was addressed simply to Ski Thorpe Abbots, with no other identification. Inside was a single sentence, written in neat block letters. "Thank you for the speed." It was unsigned. Kowalski never confirmed the story, but when he died in 1991, his family found the letter among his belongings, folded and worn, tucked into a Bible that had been issued to him in 1943. What Michael Kowalski did in the winter and spring of 1944 was not heroic in the way we typically understand heroism. He did not fly combat missions. He did not face enemy fire. He did not charge a machine gun nest or drag wounded men from burning aircraft. What he did was quiet, technical, and invisible. He took a machine built to tolerances and specifications and pushed it beyond those limits because he understood that the men flying those machines needed every advantage they could get. And in doing so, he embodied a truth about the nature of war that is often overlooked. Wars are not won only by those who fight, but by those who make fighting possible. For every pilot who flew a B-17 into the flak and fire over Germany, there were 10 men on the ground who kept that bomber flying. Armorers who loaded the bombs, fuel technicians who filled the tanks, mechanics who crawled into engine cowlings in the freezing darkness and made machines work that had no reason to work. Kowalski's story is their story. It is the story of the men who understood that doctrine and protocol and engineering manuals were tools, not scriptures. That sometimes survival required breaking the rules. That sometimes the right thing to do was the thing you'd be court-martialed for if it went wrong, and forgotten if it went right. The pilots who flew bombers Kowalski had modified did not know, in most cases, what had been done to their aircraft. They knew only that their engines ran smoother, that they had speed when they needed it, that the aircraft responded in ways they didn't expect. They attributed it to luck, or to the skill of the crew, or to the mysterious grace that sometimes allows men to survive the unsurvivable. But it was not luck. It was knowledge. It was experience. It was a young man from Cleveland, Ohio, who looked at a propeller hub and saw not a piece of machinery but a promise that if he did his job right, 10 men would come home. And for a few months in 1944, in the cold and the darkness and the smell of high-octane gasoline and engine oil, that promise was kept. Epilogue. There is a propeller blade in the National Museum of the United States Air Force, mounted on a wall in the World War II gallery. It is from a B-17G, serial number unrecorded, recovered from a salvage yard in Belgium in the 1980s. The blade is bent, scarred by shrapnel, the leading edge pitted and worn. A small placard beside it reads, "Hamilton Standard Propeller, B-17 Flying Fortress, used in operations over Europe, 1944. There is no mention of modifications, no reference to unauthorized pitch adjustments or recalibrated governors. To the thousands of visitors who pass the exhibit each year, it is simply a piece of history, a fragment of the machine that helped win the war. But if you look closely, if you know what to look for, you can see the marks. Scratches on the hub where a wrench bit into the metal, a slightly irregular wear pattern on the blade, where the pitch angle was adjusted outside factory specifications. The fingerprints of a man who made the machine better than it was supposed to be. Wars are fought with courage and firepower and strategy. But they are won sometimes by men in the darkness with wrenches in their hands, making small changes that add up to survival. They are won by the knowledge that the rules are not the answer, that sometimes the answer is written in grease and metal, and the cold arithmetic of life and death. Michael Kowalski did not call himself a hero. He called himself a mechanic. And in the winter of 1944, when the sky over Germany was full of fire and the bombers came home on smoking engines and shredded wings, that was enough. The propeller turned. The engines ran. The men came home. And somewhere in the cold English dawn, A young man with grease on his hands looked up at the sky and knew that he had done what mattered.